this moment, we're hurting, aren't we? The world feels like it's on fire, right? We're watching horrors that we think we've seen before, and it shreds us all afresh. I was born and grew up in Guatemala. I moved to the States like high school, close to college, and I go back home every year. And sometimes I spend the whole summer, sometimes just a month. I was just there for a month, had one of the happiest months of my life back home. Renewed my citizenship, all kind of stuff, saw friends. I was a bit incognito because in an honor shame culture with like 200 people, you know you're gonna offend. So I was a little sneaky. A few days after I left, you guys probably don't even know because it's eclipsed by everything else. I grew up during the Civil War, during coup d'etats, and what's happening now hasn't happened since the 70s and 80s. And I'm in constant text with them. This is just Guatemala, linda, bella, Chapinlandia, preciosa, this big. The highest, there's a lot of rural poverty, extreme poverty. The current pre-pandemic, I stumble over this, the highest, the most years of education that children had was 4.7 years, not even finishing elementary school. Post-pandemic, it's 2.4. We know the power of education, right? We believe in Jesus. We also know that education and access to education changes. Of course, mi gente are coming to our borders, right? This is yesterday. We are losing so many weeks of classes. Food security. We have no access to fresh food and vegetables. All 52 markets in the city have been closed. The airport can't get gas, it's shut down. The hospitals can't get water. Millions of people that struggle to get to and from work can't because there's no public transportation and the roads are blocked. And the poorest of the poor, who live and scavenge in the largest intra-urban garbage dump in Latin America, they're going hungry. The poor always suffer the most. Israel, we're not let. We will hear about that soon. But David Katiba and Todd Deathridge, we love you, we honor you, and we want to hear from you. I don't know if you guys have seen the stats recently. Children in poverty doubled in the US the past year. We know that children, if children can thrive and we can reduce the ACEs, we've avoided entering the criminal justice system, addiction, housing insecurity, like on and on. This is the US, doubled. The fourth opioid wave. It's fentanyl and heroin. It's the worst cocktail, and all the drugs to help address it aren't working. But this is our work 24/7, 365, isn't it? There's a news cycles, but our work is showing up for the one in our context, for the two, for the three. The theme of this gathering is limits. The last gathering was peacemaking, bridge building, reconciliation, which is all of our work. This one is on limits. Limits of money, policies, volunteers, agencies, systems, structures, walls, the limits of our bodies, the limits of our minds, the limits of our emotions, the limits of our neurology and our nervous system, ours and those whom we serve, right? We're all underwater. Does it feel like the word unprecedented is basically a cuss word for really bad news? Right? I'm so sick of that word because it precedes something bad that nobody has a capacity to engage with or address. So we've got collective trauma going on. You guys are tired. If I could add another day, I'd basically assign you guys 24 hours of nap. Just sleep. Because we always have to start with our bodies. I didn't plan the topic. My team did. I had a team. The content of this, I'll come back to it, but they ran with it. I didn't. But I feel like they crafted the gathering for me. I didn't plan on the current form of solidarity with brokenness in my body and my brain, and therefore my heart and soul. In 2019, it wasn't even a year after my accident. Herb has been razzing me. He says, don't say after the accident, say after my resurrection. Yes. But I feel like both actually are true, right? If you had a chance to listen to the interview, then you'll know some of this context. If you haven't, it's the only place I've allowed my story to be posted. But in 2019, with you in DC at Restoration, I was barely upright. I shared my story with you because it felt like this community we earn each other's stories in some ways. I've shared it like the long public version at our church, so just twice. I don't like how our world commodifies story now. We use it like dopamine hits, right? Next most whatever dramatic something or another. My story doesn't feel like it's mine. It feels like it's the body of Christ and God's, but what I'll share with you here, I've been praying about for months, and I didn't feel the last kind of green light until about 3 days ago. So for those of you who don't know, I was putting gas in my car, our car. It had run out of gas on the road, and I was hit by a truck, a distracted driver. He totaled 2 cars, hit me, totaled a third. I was deemed dead on scene. No pulse, no breath, eyes open, unmoving. Time passed, eyewitnesses told my kids that I was gone. Over time, I took a breath. There's a whole progression from there of living in between life and death. There's hardly any body part that got smashed. A lot of my injuries now are invisible, and I am the fact that I can walk, that I can be here. So A few months ago, I had another round of, don't click the slide yet, I had another round of brain scans. I'm going to show you some of those. These brain scans are what are currently, it's not the week of the accident. This is currently brain scans. And with this, and part of why we're setting up the next 2 days, and Benjamin's just gonna kick us off with something so beautiful. I wish we could stop time and listen to him for 10 hours. Is we live with this tension and paradox of miracle and suffering, hope and grief, desolation, consolation. I mean, it's all there, right? And all of us are living it. I mean, I bet if we went around, we're all in this. So first one. So this is an MRI. An MRI mostly shows the physical damage and impact. The circle on the right bottom. Oh, okay, so if you guys don't know an MRI, the top is the front, and this is a view from the top. So I had, my whole face was shattered, like potato chips crushed, and I had multiple cranial fractures, and I had a craniotomy. But there you can see still the vestiges of one of the cranial fractures, bottom right. At the very top where you see the line, that's the skull, you see like white, above the green circle, you see white, white, space, white. You see that? So the white there is scar tissue, and then there's just empty space. The green shows permanent brain damage. I surprise got to meet the inventor of the MRI. When I was in Cambridge for sabbatical with my husband, we were like, we're just gonna go to C.S. Lewis Chapel, whatever, they're having a meeting, and the speaker was on science and faith. The dude's the inventor of the MRI. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm such like a fangirl kid. fMRI, don't click yet. An fMRI shows function and blood flow. So fMRIs are what? So this was recent. I have like 6 neurologists. This one, he sees thousands and thousands and thousands of these. He works with professional football players and all kind of other. So an fMRI shows blood flow and function. The way that they demonstrate it here, it's color-coded to show the different parts of the brain. So let's go to the next slide. So this is kind of the outer, I mean, you guys that know this stuff better, you'll know all the terms. I'm so exhausted by medical terms, and I forget them. I think I'm gonna remember and I forget. This shows like above, below, side. The color coding is the parts of the brain. Is anyone a medical person, like that actually knows this stuff? I'm the expert in the room. So this is a normal brain. So what I'm going to show now is so the way they demonstrate the gaps is this isn't physical gaps. This is blood flow and function, okay? So you're not seeing like a hole, but you're seeing gaps. So this is my brain right now. So go back to the normal and go to now. Dr. Makwana, for the first 15 minutes of the assessment call, because he hadn't met me, because he specializes in this. He hadn't met me before the scans. He kept interrupting himself. It's like, you have the most severe frontal lobe damage I've ever seen. You should not be talking. You should not be smiling. You should not be able to articulate the way you have. And then, there's frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe. Those are the main ones that I'm like smashed up. Next one, this one, so here you can see side by side. This one is more the internal, so thalamus, all that stuff. This is a normal brain. This is harder to explain, it's more nuanced. And this is mine. So actually, thalamus, basal ganglia, all of that. Miracle afoot now. Like, it makes no sense. Plus, I take issue with, I have a really robust theology of suffering, and I identify more with every story that's not miracle than stories that are. At the same time, as he explained everything, the explanatory power of what I live with every day, right? It's like, thank you, such validation. At the end of it, I turned to my husband and I said, do you see why every day is a battle? I'm working so hard every day just to show up. There's so many stories to tell in this. The bigger picture in terms of limits, and you're going to hear other stories, and you have your stories. I've damaged vocal cords. My vocal cords don't close. That means that I can't sing because I lose too much oxygen and I can pass out. I love to sing. I have so many scars in my head. I'm deaf in my left ear and hard of hearing significantly in my right ear. I have a partial aneurysm in my carotid artery. My lungs don't last long sometimes. I can't drive for very long because one of the impacts has to do with sensory overload. This part of this stuff, sensory overload and impaired mental flexibility in the moment. So quick decision making, which driving is, if you taught a teenager recently, it's all about senses, right? It's like feel, look, hear, right? Here's the deal. We are all temporarily able-bodied. This is all our story. Jenny's going to write a book about her journey with her daughter. So I brought some of my visual aids. These are what I live with. It's a snail. If you heard the thing. It's a snail. What else? Butterflies. I mean, the whole chrysalis business. They look dead in that. I'm just going to put it here. You saw it, butterflies. What else? Oh, fall leaves. Do you know that fall leaves are... Oh, well, that's a cool shelf. Do you know that fall leaves, this is creation dying, but in glory, gorgeous. It's death. It's so beautiful. Let's see, what else? I have more, but I'll just stop there, except I'll show you this one. I'll leave it out. It's Japanese. It's a woman's body clinging to the cross, and her hands are on the other side. Because as much as I experienced God's closeness and intimacy and saw things that I can't unsee, it's a lot harder to live on this side of the accident. And I really wonder at times why he just didn't take me. And the cloud of witnesses that live on the threshold. Anyone that has someone close die feels that, right? So I'm going to finish my words here because Benjamin's going to lead us. And before that, Manasseh is going to introduce him, and he's going to be an awesome palate cleanser of fun. We're talking in Matthew 25 work. It's all about all kind of spectrums and thresholds, right? So I would be diagnosed with a moderate to severe brain injury, but I function as someone with a mild brain injury. Take any of our work, immigrant work, homeless, housed, families, moms, at-risk children. We want language to honor complexity and spectrums. I have two last things to say. But before that, on the spectrums thing, I taught at the university, the private liberal arts university in Austin before the accident. My days are half-mast, about 50% function, some days altogether gone. I taught writing, argument development, and critical thinking. Now, I literally cannot be succinct. My brain won't do it. I taught concise writing. John Swinton, who Benjamin studied under, in the book Becoming Friends of Time, he talks about the Western educated world privileges speed, speech patterns that go back and forth. Succinct long-windedness is looked down on, right? There's so many subtle ways that we don't offer hospitality to the world. The arc of the narrative of our time together at the gathering is I swear my team did this. I didn't plan it this way. We're starting in how, all the different, like if we start with, we are a migrant people, then we can enter all of our work, right, through that lens as an icon. Here, we're going to be entering from a theology of disabilities that has to do with intractable things. There's no, tidy answers in this. But then moving out to other limits in our bodies. And Luann will be speaking to that, her story, as well as her work in journalism and in marginalized communities. Bethany, who has lived for, decades now, in evil that I hear, I can't even say the words because it shocks me. And Jake Stum will be taking all of that and calling on the church for mobilizing. We will have quiet, we will have fun, we will have a dance party, which is my requirement for every gathering. And we're gonna bend a little bit towards the since my accident as opposed to since my resurrection, so that then we can head towards the resurrection, right? I just use that as code. Y'all followed me, right? I'm gonna read this and then Benjamin's gonna come up. When Liberator looked at the crowd, he went up a mountain. Oh, this is all of you. This is a blessing over you and the people you companion. When Liberator looked at the crowd, he went up a mountain and sat down to encourage his people. He opened his mouth and spoke to his crew, saying, "Divine favors on those battered and bruised by the storms of life. To them belongs the reign and the rule of my Father. Divine favor rests on all those whose trauma erupts into tears or disassociation, for they shall know healing and comfort. Divine favor rests on those gentle, wounded souls, for they will inherit a world of wonder. Divine favor rests on those whose trauma, skip that one. Divine favor rests on those whose hearts burn for justice, and for the world to be stripped of injustice, oppression, and domination. They shall be filled, satisfied, and made whole. Divine favor rests on those filled with mercy and who walk the path of forgiveness. I'm struggling to forgive on a lot of stuff. For they will behold the beauty of God. Divine favor rests on those who seek to bring peace in a world of conflict. They are the sons and daughters that the Father always wanted. Divine favor rests on those who seek to walk in kindness, but are bullied, abused, and mistreated. To them belongs the reign and rule of my Father. Hola, mi bello, venite. This is Manassés Arias. Learn the full name. The accent is on the last syllable. He's my Central American brother, Hondureño Americano. He's going to be the one introducing our speakers, praying, and leading our dance party because he learned several dances, brand new ones, just for this. Line dancing, all that stuff.
Good evening, everybody. As Christine mentioned, my name is Manassés Arias, and usually when I talk to human beings, or a group of human beings, it's with people who are 3 times younger than me. So, because I'm a second grade teacher. So, just to make sure I got y'all with me, I want to do something that I do in my second grade class. But y'all are confident adults, so I know y'all will do this. So, show me antlers. This is where we do this, which means I got all of y'all's attention and your eyes. Antlers. That means there's nothing fiddling in your hands, maybe no fidget toys, none of that. No Thank you. Before I even continue, I wanted to share this scripture passage because I want to channel my inner Christine Warner. And I'm going to read it in Spanish first because this is my heart language, in the language I grew up in, and then in English, which is the language I learned. Psalm 133, Salmos 133, versículo 1 dice, mirad cuán bueno y cuán delicioso es habitar los hermanos juntos en armonía. Psalm 133, verse 1 says, behold how good and how pleasant it is when God's people dwell together in unity. So again, I'm going to channel my inner Christine Warner and just see the delight of the beautiful faces that are before me, the familiar faces like Jason back there, Tom Barker, my roommate, and to the new friends like Michael and Theo from Denver, Oh, a friend, a familiar friend, I'm sorry. Not former, whoopsies. A still friend, my apologies, is David Katiba over there. Let's see, I see. And then some church family like Stephen Hubbard, Madison Miller back there. And actually, I get the privilege of having Benjamin Wall, who is also church family, and introducing him. Benjamin Wall was one of the first persons I've met when I moved down to Greensboro, North Carolina. It was during the pandemic. It was August 29, 2020, when I moved from upstate New York, drove 9 hours straight down to North Carolina. And he was one of the first ones to welcome me, and it is such an honor and a privilege to present him. And he is an author, and he published a book called Welcome as a Way of Life, a practical theology of John Vanier, which is an incredible book for those who love to read. And he's going to contribute, and he's contributing to another book that is coming out at the beginning of next year called Betrayal of Witness, and which is an attempt to make meaning of the life and work of John Ye in light of his betrayal of witnessing. Benjamin Wall is also married to a wonderful woman named Leah Wall, and their incredible 3 kids that I've also got to meet, and they also welcomed me. So please welcome Benjamin Wall.
I was contemplating just breaking it in front of all of you, since I'm going to be talking about limitations and suffering and all of that. I think I'm just going to use this instead of trying to put all that on me or whatever. But first and foremost, I just want to say, Christine, I am glad that you exist. Power perfected in weakness, embodied in this woman. And your story is our story. And I hope that, let's do this. Just turn to your neighbor and say, I'm glad you exist. Thank you. So, I've been asked to help frame our time together over the next few days to name things rightly, to do that which God called humanity to do before he called them to do other things. The first thing was to name things rightly, and to name things rightly in a way that will help us make meaning of our time together as we take time, waste time, to reflect well on what it means to be and become human. As we seek to acknowledge and confess that we are liminal creatures. That is, we are creatures with and marked by a variety of limitations who believe in the impossible. In what seems absolutely absurd, that God's power is made perfect in weakness, that God chooses the foolish, weak, and lowly things of the world to confound the wise and strong. That God deliberately chooses persons that this world, and unfortunately some of our churches, overlook, exploit, and abuse. Nobodies, to expose the hollow pretensions of the somebodies, the things that are to nullify the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. Is this not the mystery of the gospel? That God, in the person of Jesus Christ, came into the world not simply to serve the least of these, but became one counted among the least. This is the mystery of the gospel. God in flesh. God in flesh did not come to simply serve the poor, but became poor. The one through and by whom everything was made, created, is able to sympathize with our weakness in every respect, because he himself is beset with weakness. Jesus Christ is God's yes to creation, as liminal as it is and we may be. Amen. If you're here this week to breathe, if you're here to take a break, maybe you're seeking some respite for yourself, a nap, or a retreat for the difficult work of caring for and being present with and to others. Maybe you're here this week and you're legitimately wondering, can I continue this work? Maybe you're worn out. You feel weak. Maybe you're even wounded. I have some good news for you. You're right where you need to be. I believe deep down that you are right where the Father wants you to be, utterly dependent upon Him, to hold us and to help us attempt to hold it all together. The Lord wants to remind us that the ministry in which we participate is His ministry. And the Spirit of God wants us to hold on to the hope that God's power is manifesting itself in our weakness, in our limitations, along with all the accompanying pain and suffering that comes with being human. Looks like I got a little mixed up here. So, if you're weak, wounded, and worn out, if you're limited, and I'm assuming that we all are, then you are enough to be a servant of the Most High. So, over the past few weeks, and about 496 text messages with Christine, I have had many ideas, and she has as well, about what to share with you today. I've spent a good amount of time outlining many various paths to take, but all of them, for some odd reason, kept leading me back to the story of Job. I'm not sure if this is because Job's story is a story full of loss, limitations, alienation, marginalization, stigma, weakness, woundedness, or if it's a story of absolutely absurd perseverance, self-advocacy for the innocent, or faithful resistance. What I do know is that all of these themes and threads will be explored during our time together this week. Maybe it's just because I've been reading a good bit of liberation theology and will probably prophetically become heretical in your sight in the next 45 minutes. This is not a sermon, but it will sound like one. But what I want to do is attempt to provide you with a theology from the trenches, or a theology on top of trash heaps. All to say, Job it is. And so I hope that you will see that the story of Job is the story of God within the story of our lives, and the lives of those that we care for and do life with. I also just want to, as a side note, just say that as I narrate Job's story as our story, as God's story within the story of our lives, it might not sound succinct. And this is just part of me living out, welcoming my own ADD, ADHD, and trying to write it all down myself. I hope you'll see these as vignettes or just prophetic ramblings of sorts, but maybe food for thought. So if I say something, you're interested in it, if you think I'm wrong, I'm probably wrong. That's my limits. Just come tell me, and we'll have a conversation around the fire with some really good scotch. So, these are the days of our lives. Like Job, we live in a world that feels and looks like chaos. You know, often I and those I care for, those who I walk alongside and attempt to suffer with, we feel like those disciples in Jesus' boat, just absolutely confused, bewildered, afraid, fearful, even terrorized by the storms of life, which seem unfair. They are unfair. Let's just name it. They're unjust. They're utterly meaningless at times. They just don't make sense. And so we try to make our meaning of our lives in the world in which we live, right? And with the limited understanding that we all have, we, like Job, try to understand how and why certain things happen, either to us or to those we love. Why loss? Why limitations? Why alienation? Why stigma? Why pain? Why suffering exists in the world that God has created? And whether spoken out loud or not, we often want to know why these things happen to us or to our loved ones. Why did this thing happen to me? Why is she like that? Why was he born that way? Why do limitations and impairments, disabilities even exist? How can I continue to live like this? What is the life worth living? We want to know how weakness and woundedness, limitations, pain, even evil can exist in a good world created by a God we confess to be all good. We want to know if any and all of this has any purpose. Now, I think it's important for me to note that although I have lumped together all these conditions, weakness, woundedness, impairments, disabilities, limitations, pain, suffering, evil, etc., I'm not suggesting that those of us and others who live life with a disability or impairment directly suffer. In other words, we must not assume that people with disabilities and impairments suffer necessarily because of their disability or impairment. For many people, this is just life. Of course, they do suffer too, though the suffering they often endure has more to do with the ways both the church and the world marginalizes and penalizes and disables them socially. When your ability to find a home, to live, food, resources, or your ability to lead or even pastor or preach or serve in a church is tied directly to your productivity, identifying as disabled is not something people want to do. This is the type of suffering that I am speaking of throughout this talk in relation to disability in particular. A social or ecclesial disabling reality when we disable them through misrecognition and stigma, through normal, normate, able-bodied assumptions. Though there are many people who relate suffering to and with their actual disability, which is important, with their limitation, with their impairment, etc. And this is why I think it's so vital, please hear this, to listen to the stories of others. Amy Kinney, who wrote My Body Is Not a Prayer Request on the first few pages, goes out of her way to say, I am disabled. Redeeming Perfect by Amy E. Jacober goes out of her way to say, I don't like that. You know, you'll see some other slides throughout my talk. I might forget to actually stop and talk about them, but these are 4 books that do really incredible kind of personal stories, the first 2, and then the last 2, Disability, Living into the Diversity of Christ's Body by Brian Brock. He's professor of practical theology, as well as John Swinton, Finding Jesus in the Storm, subtitle. I think it says something about the Christian stories or the story of Christians with mental illness. They do some heavy lifting of sorts in a very accessible way around the conversation of naming things rightly, but also living into the diversity of our limits of language, right? This is a lot about liminality, and part of that we could add to the list that Christine gave us is that we're limited in our language across cultures and people. And so you'll find people who may consider themselves disabled using that term freely, and others who are disabled saying, no, it's just a social reality that I have to carry as a phenomenon to get me a food and a house and an interpreter, etc., etc. The point is, we want to know if any and all this has purpose. And so we often land somewhere between suffering, liminality, whether from the reality itself or as a result of said reality, does or does not have purpose. So we're kind of prone to believe God either allows or causes us to suffer, whether from the reality the limitation itself or as a result of said reality, as a natural consequence of our sin, or that our weakness, woundedness, limitations, and all the accompanying pain, alienation, marginalization, stigma, suffering, yada, 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 is for some greater good. Or we believe that all of this is utterly gratuitous, that it has no true meaning or purpose at all. And I think these attempts, while they attempt to make sense of all this, is certainly understandable, and they may function well at an intellectual level. The truth is that such explanations don't really address the relentless alienation and injustice we endure from these things, or the pain and suffering of the world. When faced with our own limits and those of others, irrespective of their causes, what we want is not a logical formula. To be honest, I would put before you that such explanations often do more harm than help. Too often they silence the voice of those who already feel voiceless. They alienate those who already feel alienated from themselves and others. You know, in the 38th chapter of the book of Job, we find Job sitting down, surrounded by friends who spend a good amount of time trying to convince him that his suffering must be the result of God's displeasure with him. That Job had to have done something to deserve the suffering that had come upon him. I assume many of you have met many people in the line of work that you're participating in who believe the same about themselves, about their station in life or their condition, maybe even you too. And Job certainly understands why his friends believe this to be true about himself. I mean, in fact, before his life was turned upside down and he lost everything, Job most likely believed what his friends believed. In fact, we get a glimpse of this in the world Job describes in Job 29, where Job was the center of the universe, sitting in judgment at the city gates, surrounded by family and possessions, and admired by all. Most likely, Job and everyone who knew him believed that his success, his health, his wealth, they were rewards from God for his righteousness, right? The idea that God always rewards the faithful, always punishing the unfaithful. It was a common belief in the ancient world. The reality is, we see echo of it day after day in the life of the church and in the life of the work that we do. But God's response to Job, as we will soon discover, reveals that God is not some divine robot that functions according to a predetermined set of coded instructions rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked. Now, being faithful is certainly worthwhile in itself. However, and you know this, I'm preaching to the choir, faithfulness may not necessarily lead to personal gain, the lack of limitations, material success, right? Job knows this. In fact, he's convinced of it now because he knows he's not done one damn thing wrong to deserve what he has had to endure. Deep down, Job knows that what he and his friends have come to believe about God and about himself and what it means to be and to become human is not true. You know, I will never forget hearing Dr. John Swinton tell a story of a woman who was deaf and blind responding to a question about heaven during a doctoral seminar at the University of Aberdeen a few years ago. The story challenged and actually changed my thinking about disability, the Bible, and heaven. In summary, John was leading a seminar on disability and Christian faith, and a conversation emerged about disabilities and heaven. After a few students offered their thoughts on what they thought heaven might be like, and whether or not disabilities would be in heaven, this woman, whose lived experience was different than many others, began to sign, and through her interpreter, began to communicate to everyone in the seminar that ever since she was a young child, she has been told more than anything else that she's a child of God, made in the image of God. And so throughout her life, she's had many dreams of heaven. And that one of the most beautiful things about heaven for her is that Jesus signs so perfectly. You see, for her, the kingdom of heaven is a lot like Jesus' descriptions, which are primarily focused on the renewal of human perception and relationships. I mean, it's some food for thought, and this is why you have to buy Luann's book. Like, the way we think and pray about healing may be as limiting to ourselves and others as the very limits for which we pray. And disability, well, I was going to put this out there. Theologically speaking, to experience someone as disabled is not to recognize at all. It's to misrecognize them. This has worked out in all of these 4 books. Of course, Henry Nouwen, Adam, you know the story of Henry Nouwen. If not, talk to Christine, talk to me. Raise your hand if you've read that, or talk to these people. Thomas Reynolds, he's a professor at the University of Toronto. He has a child who Tourette's, autism, doesn't live life like most of the people. Brian Brock has a son. He's at the University of Aberdeen, named Adam as well. Winter District Limited. So John Gillibrand, he's an Anglican priest in the Church of England. All 4 of these books are doing work around this conversation of human perception and disability, and not everyone is healed that's prayed for, and all that good stuff. So for this woman, disability is more than meets the eyes, right? Disability is what occurs when the church and world require someone who is deaf, mute, and partially blind to do all the heavy lifting to assimilate to us, to learn our language in order to accommodate our way of doing things. Then when a couple of them show up, not just one, for at least the 5th time, we then get a church meeting together to talk about whether or not we need to hire someone so that they can understand us. You know, Joni and Friends is another resource. Joni is another story of someone who was wounded, like Christine, not born that way, who has a different view of heaven. The Collaborative on Faith and Disabilities, and this is an annual institute. I think it was just held at Baylor University, which for all of you in Austin, people close to Baylor, Eric Carter from Vanderbilt University just moved to take a chair position in research and is heading up this whole thing around disability, mental health, and the church. I wholeheartedly encourage you all, but particularly those closer to Baylor, to take advantage of that. The Institute of Theology and Disability, about 80% of the people who participate are people being cared for, people who have visible cognitive developmental limitations. And their voice is being amplified as we witness to their witness, which is a way to contend for hope, by the way, to witness to the witness of others. You know, deep down, Job knows that what he and his friends have come to believe is not good, it's not right, it's not true. And to be honest, even if their beliefs and explanations were true, they would never provide relief to the actual loss, alienation, pain, stigma, and suffering that Job has endured. So I think there's wisdom for us in acknowledging that even our best explanations and attempts to make sense of our liminality doesn't make it go away. This is not to deny the explanatory power that Christine is talking about. I would just say she is embodying the proper stewardship of that power in her own life. I think it's also worth saying that just outright that the book of Job resists all suggestions that suffering is a matter of some kind of verdict of divine justice. It rejects any suggestion that those whose lives that are marked by weakness, woundedness, limitation, impairment, and or suffering are not incomparably worthy or cannot be righteous or favored by God. You are loved by God. Each and every one of you is incomparably worthy. A side note on stigma, because that's happening with Job's friends, right? Stigma, simply stated, is a way of stealing someone's story. Simply stated, stigma is a way of stealing someone's story or forcing the person to accept a false or negative identity. This is why how we think and speak of God matters. If we get God wrong in the least, we get everything wrong. Who we are, how we are, what it means to be human, how and who we are in relation to others. Stigma reduces people living in, with, and under unconventional realities of all sorts to the shape and form of our perceptions and caricatures of the implications of those said realities. Right? So an example of this in the mental health world would be when people cease to be perceived as people. When my friend Brennan is rarely ever identified as Brennan, he's autistic. When my friend Janelle lost her name through pastoral and care contexts in my church, she's bipolar. She has personality disorder. It's a death sentence. The pathological power of explanation in naming things wrongly leads to all sorts of human suffering. If you can take a whole people, take them out of their land, and assign them numbers, that's the Holocaust. For Job, bad theology doesn't prevail to the glory of God, we would say, but it certainly led others to attempt to force their story on him, right? You're suffering, Job, because you're a sinner, like a good Calvinist. You're a sinner, right? God is a wise judge. He knows you've sinned. You're wicked. You're foolish. He's disciplining you. Oh, God gave this to you because he knew you could handle it. You see, they misrepresented God's character and God's nature, and as a result, they misrecognize Job. They stigmatize and further alienate him from himself, from others, and from the God who made them all. So here's the story. Job's a righteous man, religious in every way, but as the story goes on, we know he loses everything. And we know why, right? Because it's the Satan setting a test allowed by God to see if Job's faithfulness is offered freely or for some other reason. Is Job only worshiping in obedient ways because he has been blessed? Job loses all. He ends up on a heap of ashes, scraping himself and his disgusting sores with broken pieces of pottery. And as I've already alluded, 3 friends show up to comfort him by repeatedly reminding him that he's a sinner and that those who do evil deeds, well, they always receive their just rewards from God. And then they stick around for him to die just to watch him take his last breath to say, "See, we told you so." But to everybody's surprise, Job refuses. He refuses to accept the fate his friends are projecting upon him. He refuses to accept the fate his friends believe God has predestined for his life. And rightly so. He remains faithful in his resistance, and he questions its justice. Sisters and brothers, this is hope. Hope of refusal of injustice. Job's friends may have expected a silent death, but instead they received the protest of someone convinced that God is not what they think. Job cannot imagine why he is where he is, why he has had to suffer the loss of everything. And so he cries out. And man, does he cry out. He cries out with just sheer, naked, untamed honesty. I think Job's crying out to God reveals something to us. that's important about the relationship between our limits, about human suffering and God's judgment. You see, for Job, like many of the people in the Bible, particularly the psalmists, God's judgment is actually good news. It's actually what they long for, which is to say that what we discover in Job, he views his suffering as a lack of God's judgment rather than the presence of it. Job is crying out for justice. And from the depths of his being, his cry for justice reveals that there is something definitely wrong in this neat world of reward and punishment. And in the face of this obvious injustice, he refuses to be silent. Sisters and brothers, this is hope. Hope is the refusal to be silent. And so over 36 long chapters, I'm not going to read it, Job cries out. And his cries of injustice rise to the heavens. And Job challenges every presumption he and his friends had been taught to believe about the world, about what it means to be human, and the God who made it in them. Job laments. He begins by cursing the day he was born, but he does not curse God, which means that he's a better person than me. Probably most of us, right? We all know you probably, just joking. He does complain about God because he's experiencing his suffering, again, as abandonment by God. I wonder if you know people in your line of work who have this same understanding or this belief that they experience their suffering as though God is absent. So I want us to take a moment, close your eyes, and just reflect on this point, because I think this is crucial. We are people of hope who believe that the hope of the poor will not be taken away, that the hope of the poor will not perish forever, Psalm 9. How are we to proclaim the reign of love, hope, and justice to those who live in an inexplicable situation that denies this very reign? Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Together, Lord, have mercy. How to speak of God, how to speak to God in the midst of suffering and liminality. That is the question, right? What language is applicable to God in the midst of all these realities? Have you struggled to speak of God in the midst of suffering, your own or that of others? You see, this is a challenge that is not limited to Job, but to every believer, if not every person. And as Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, asks, how are we going to bring joyous or hopeful conviction to our utterance of the name of God? Through his cries and protests, through his self-advocacy, advocating for all sufferers, Job protests. Not only does he protest against his suffering, but in his rebellion, Job protests against the suffering of the innocents and the belief that he must put his faith in a God who rewards faithfulness always and always punishes unfaithfulness. You see, Job's rebellion is not only against suffering of the innocent, but against any and all theology that justifies that mindset. If we are to accept that everything comes from God, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord, then Job for us models how accepting God's will is not simple resignation to it, but a way of complaint, bewilderment and confrontation, faithful protest. You see, in Job we discover faith is lived, right? And it's lived in wrestling. It's a genuine encounter. The word encounter in contra, it presumes contradiction and confrontation. It's the beginning of faith. Chronologically, as Job precedes the story of Israel, but even with the story of Abraham and Israel, Jacob. It's a wrestling with God that we see in Job, a lived faith. And to everyone's surprise, God responds. God responds in the most unexpected way that rightly reestablishes Job and Job's understanding of God and the world that God fearfully and wonderfully made. Out of this whirlwind, God says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins, I will question you, and you shall declare to me, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" You know, one of the most interesting things that I find about God's response to Job is that on the surface, hear that? Let's repeat. He said, on the surface, God doesn't even acknowledge Job's suffering. And God doesn't entertain Job's questions about justice. Instead, God takes Job on a tour of the cosmos, beginning with the foundation of the earth, the birth of the sea. As one commentator notes, God spends a lot of time where the wild things are. I wish I had that Matthew McConaughey voice where I could say it like that, where the wild things are. Describing all kinds of untamed creatures, lions and mountain goats, deer, wild donkey and oxen, ostriches, eagles, and two prehistorical monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan, both of which represent chaos in the ancient world. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit that this is not the answer that Job or I expected from God. In fact, I reread, and I was trying to reread again this week in preparation for finalizing these touch points here, and I am still utterly dissatisfied at times. I was like, this is utter BS. I mean, think about it. Suffering makes us a stranger to ourselves. And it certainly makes us a stranger to others. This book here, Raging with Compassion, does some really good work for pastors. If you're a pastor and you don't have money to buy the book, come see me. I will buy that book for you. Be honest. Suffering makes us a stranger to ourselves and to others. It alienates us from ourselves and others, and too often our first reaction to our own suffering or the suffering of others is to be repelled. We say things to ourselves and to others like this: "This thing that is happening to me is not really me. Is it?" We say those dumb things, right? Again, God chose you because he knew you could handle it. You see, whether it is our suffering or the suffering of others, regardless of its cause, liminality bothers us very deeply. Our humanity bothers us. To be completely honest with you, it's for these reasons that I expected God to respond at least with a little bit of comfort. I mean, is it wrong? Is it wrong to want God to tell Job about the wager with the Satan? Is it wrong for me to desire God to acknowledge Job's suffering, or at least even to apologize for all of it? I mean, what are we to make of this? Job cries out for justice. He desires what God says God desires. And God says, how freaking fast can the dumb ostrich cross the road? Super fast. This is not the answer I think anyone expects from God, and yet it's on the surface, right? God's response to Job cannot be easily dismissed. Like a powerful thunderstorm, God's response to Job is actually beautiful if we think about it. It's fascinating, and it is a little more than terrifying. The images and the creatures described in God's response, I think, are meant to take hold of our holy imaginations, Job's imagination, and introduce us and Job to a world that is much bigger and much brighter and much wonderful than ourselves. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garments and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a sill. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arm is broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all of this. Can you bind the chains of Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way so that they come back to report to you? Here we are. Who gives the ibis wisdom, or gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of the earth stick together? What are we to make of this? Hope. God's answer. It breaks open Job's world. It expands his vision to include places and creatures Job never imagined in his former life. You see, God paints a picture for us of a world that is wild and free, that is wild and beautiful. For God, the world is not made for human beings. Neither is it entirely safe for us. We know this by our limits. In it, creatures are wild and free, and God takes special delight in those creatures that are outside the boundaries of human existence, outside the control of humanity. And God gives creatures the freedom and gracefulness to be who they are created to be, with their limits, wild and beautiful. So now we're just going to pause, and I'm going to say, in good Fred Rogers fashion, I want you to turn to your neighbor and let them know they are beautiful just the way they are. So turn to your neighbor and say, I like you just the way you are. All right. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. This is hope, that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. This is hope. This is our response to liminality, irrespective of the many forms it takes in our lives and that of others. At the heart of God's response to Job is God's revelation to Job and to us of freedom and grace, rather than retribution and reward. This is the hope we contend for, people. Freedom, liberation, and grace. In all the freedom creation is given, God maintains order by placing limits on those forces that could plunge the world into chaos. The sea, the Leviathan, the behemoth, every human wickedness in all of its manifestations. There is freedom in finitude. There is freedom in liminality. Here's two books that I think do a really good job of getting to that understanding of freedom and finitude and liminality. Just FYI, every book that's up here, plus many more, are on a table downstairs for you to go pick up, read blurbs on the back, look at the table of contents, so that you can physically have them in your hands and Trust me that I'm not making this stuff up. So this is the hope we contend for. The way the story of Job presents these great monsters that I'm always fascinated about, of the deep, the way that they're presented, it, for me, I think elaborates the creation account's view of the goodness of limits, to be honest. Even in the case of unexpected and unconventional bodies. In the face of all the haters, it's as if God belligerently asserts the beauty of everything God has made. In Disability, Living into the Diversity of the Body of Christ, a book that you saw earlier, Professor Brian Brock at the University of Aberdeen says it this way. Here, God's story with the world appears in dramatic form. God's claiming and being with these creatures precisely because they inhabit bodies that most people find frightful, stands out as something that shatters the presumption of those who are secure in what they take to be the strength and normalcy. So what does this have to do with Job's situation? Because in his anguish, he's cursing the day he was born, the day he wishes that he never existed. It's as if his lament at times is a deep dive into despair, destruction, so close to death. His suffering and alienation from himself, others, and the world he knew, it caused great anguish. In his anguish, he curses. And the only words that he's able to muster were words that expressed his desire to uncreate the world. Have you ever felt that you've been at that place? Have you ever been at that place? What does God do? God sees. God listens. Isn't that in itself amazing? This is hope. That God listens. Love is listening. For you all who might be doing work in nursing homes or with people with dementia, people who live life with Alzheimer's, aging, I put before you a really good resource. It's called Memory Bridge. Michael Verde, he's from Texas somewhere. He has a really good YouTube lecture where he begins and he says, there is no me in dementia without you. There is no me in anything without you. There is no me in me without you. And what people with dementia and Alzheimer's need most from us is us. Love is listening. Love heals the dis-ease of dementia and suffering. Michael Niebauer, stand. Everybody needs to have a conversation with this man. He's doing nursing home work, churches and nursing homes. You can go ahead and sit down, but it's kind of like how we used to consign people on the hill away from society. This man is doing that hard, difficult work of listening. Talk to Michael. God listens. Love is listening. God sees and responds. God responds. This is hope. To love is not to hide, people. Hope is contradicting the present in listening and responding. And how does God respond? God responds in a way that gets to the heart of Job's cry to make all things right. God reestablishes the order that Job curses. God celebrates. God sings. God dances. God celebrates the beauty and freedom of creation, stars and sea monsters, the lion and the raven, the antelope and the ostrich, the hawk and the horse. It's as if God insists that the parts of creation commonly experienced as monstrous and threatening are not only precious to God, but very close to the heart of God's creative and redemptive purposes. What God is doing here is revealing to Job and us that he, like scaly leviathans, reside in the most striking way at the center of God's concern. Even in the midst of his liminality and our suffering and woundedness and weakness and impairment and alienation and marginalization and limitation in life, God is for you. God is for Job. What we discover in God's revelation to Job and his friends is that their understanding of God was wrong. God has other things to attend to besides rewarding and punishing human beings. The universe is far bigger, far stranger, far more mysterious than we can imagine. And that is what God is revealing to Job and to us. Yet in Job, God gives humanity a special place in creation. But that's not what Job gets. Job gets God. God in all his holiness and creative beauty, God in all of his wonder attends to Job in a godlike way. This is hope. God's revelation is full of promise. You see, its end is not simply divine self-display, but the overcoming of human opposition, marginalization, alienation, injustice, and pride, and their replacement by wisdom and love of God. This is the hope we contend for. God's response to Job accomplishes something very profound. It moves Job out of what would have or could have been an endless cycle of despair into life again. It enables him to live freely in a world full of heartbreaking suffering and heart-stopping beauty, and to do so in a way that reflects God's own care for the world. So what do we discover in Job? Again, it's a hope worth contending for. James Cone, father of the Black liberation theology, says hope is not a theoretical concept, but a practical idea that deals with the reality of this world. More than that, hope is rebellion against injustice. You see, Job's story is our story. It is the story of God within the story of our lives. And what we find in Job is an unrelenting discontentment with and faithful resistance to injustice, particularly the suffering of the innocent. What we find in Job is a way to deal with the reality of this world. It is not necessarily the only way or the way, but it is a way. One that I hope offers us much food for thought as we seek to contemplate what it means to be a contemplative activist, a peacemaker, wayfinders in a world that has lost its way. You see, what I find in Job is a hope that contradicts the present. I agree with James Cone that hope is rebellion against injustice. Amen. God damn injustice. So how do I hope, you might ask? What gives me hope? For me, one way that I find hope and seek to hope is through listening to stories of others who have found hope. Listening to those who hope and contend for hope, your stories give me hope. To hope against all hopes. A few years ago, I witnessed an extremely rare and holy thing when a woman by the name of Jane Marcheski, who at the time was a 31-year-old, 3-time cancer survivor, showed the world how to honestly suffer well, how to faithfully lament and protest before God, and hope against all hope. You may remember Jane auditioned on America's Got Talent in the summer of 2021 under her stage name, Night Birdie. She became a viral sensation with her original song, It's Okay. Before her cancer returned to take her life, in February of 2022. She shared a part of her story, particularly on a blog that she entitled, How to Meet God at Your Lowest Point. In so many ways, her witness and story reminds me of Job's. In fact, I think Jane understood well the story of Job. So I'd like, as I'm bringing this to a conclusion, to share a bit of her story with you, which is to say, I'd like to witness to her witness. Because I think her witness provides us a hope to contend for. Again, witnessing to the witness of others is a way to hope. This is Jane's story, her words. I don't remember most of autumn because I lost my mind late in the summer, and for a long time after that, I wasn't in my body. I was a light bulb buzzing somewhere far. After the doctor told me I was dying, and after the man I married said he didn't love me anymore, I chased a miracle in California. And 16 weeks later, I got it. The cancer was gone. But when my brain caught up with it all, something broke. I later found out that all the tragedy at once had caused a physical head trauma. And my brain was sending false signals of excruciating pain and panic. I have had cancer 3 times now, and I have barely passed 30. There are times when I wonder what I must have done to deserve such a story. I spent 3 months propped against the wall. On nights that I could not sleep, I laid in the tub like an insect, staring at my reflection in the shower knob. I vomited until I was hollow. I rolled up under my robe on the tile. The bathroom floor became my place to hide, where I could scream and be ugly, where I could sob and spit and eventually doze off, happy just to be asleep, even with my head on the toilet. I fear sometimes that when I die and meet with God, that He will say, I disappointed Him, that I offended Him or failed Him. Maybe He'll say I just never learned the lesson, or that I wasn't grateful enough. But one thing I know for sure, He can never say that He did not know me. I am God's downstairs neighbor, banging on the ceiling with a broomstick. I show up at His door every day. Sometimes with songs, sometimes with curses, sometimes apologies, gifts, questions, demands. Sometimes I use my key under the mat to let myself in. Other times I sulk outside until He opens the door to let me in Himself. I have called Him a cheat and a liar, and I mean it. I have told Him I wanted to die, and I mean it. Tears have become the only prayer I know. Prayers roll over my nostrils and drip down my forearms. They fall to the ground as I reach for Him. These are the prayers I repeat night and day, sunrise, sunset. Call me bitter if you want, that's fair. Count me among the angry, the cynical, the offended, the hardened, but count me also among the friends of God. It's not the mercy that I ask for, but it's the mercy nonetheless. And somehow I've learned a prayer, a new one. Thank you. It's a prayer I don't mean yet, but I will repeat it until I do. For I have seen God in rare form. I have felt His exhale. I have laid in His shadow, swifted to read the message He wrote for me in the grass. I'm sad too, Jane. If an explanation would help, He would write me one, I know it. But maybe an explanation would start an argument between us. I don't want to argue with God. I want to lay in the hammock and trace the veins in his arms. I remind myself that I'm praying to the God who let the Israelites stay lost for decades. And they begged God to arrive, but instead he let them wander, answering prayers they didn't pray. For 40 years their shoes didn't wear out. Fire lit their path each night. Every morning he sent them mercy bread from heaven. So I'm looking hard for the answers to the prayers that I didn't pray. I look for the mercy bread that he promised to make fresh for me every morning. It's called manna, which means, what is it? That's the same question I'm asking again and again. There's mercy somewhere here, but what is it? What is it? God, what is it? I see mercy in the dusty sunlight that outlines the trees, in my mother's crooked hands, in the blanket my friend left for me, in the harmony of the wind chimes. Call me cursed, call me lost, call me scorned, but that's not all. Call me chosen, blessed, sought after. Call me the one who God whispers his secrets to. I am the one whose belly is filled with loaves of mercy that were hidden for me. Even on days when I'm not so sick, sometimes I go lay on the mat on the bathroom floor. I lay in the light to listen for him. I know it sounds crazy, and I can't really explain this, but God is in there somewhere even now. You know, I've heard it said that some people can't see God because they won't look low enough. And it's true. Look lower. God is on the bathroom floor. Sisters and brothers, I think Christian hope has curious grounds. Stanley Hartwell says the corpse of an innocent man unjustly executed is hope. And it's in that corpse, so the church believes, it confesses, is hidden the seed of the only life worth having, a life worth dying for. That seed is what transfigures the cross of Jesus into the tree of life. And if by some great power an instrument of torture can become a means of healing, the same power can do similar wonders in the present. Trust in this power. Trust in this power, a power perfected in weakness, woundedness, impairment, loss, limitation, suffering. It's finally all the church has to offer a world riddled with chaos and conflict, division, and enmity. It is a power the church's own members need. Sisters and brothers, this is the hope that we are continuing. So shortly, how does this all relate back to the liminality and weakness and woundedness? Hopefully you see it. The story of Job is our story. It's a story of disabling the narratives of dominance in our lives. It's a story of faithful resistance to the persons and powers that seek to disable us, to alienate, further marginalize those who are considered weak. It's a story of learning to wrestle with God in faith as we live with limits and acknowledge that autonomy is not what makes us human, but dependency on the other. Dependency on God, who is wholly other, and one another. And it is a story of a God who listens, who sees, and speaks. Now I'll just end with this faith for God. I didn't get into this, in fact I didn't even talk about it, but the story of Job is a story of resurrection. And it foreshadows the bodily resurrection of a God in flesh whose resurrected bodies bear the scars of being disabled on the cross. A story of power made perfect